It is a truth universally acknowledged, at least by the proprietors of respectable seaside hotels, that a guest who refuses to check out is a singular nuisance. The law frowns on him, the chambermaid despises him, and the desk clerk's life becomes a matter of careful diplomacy. Yet one seldom expects the gentleman in question to be found dead, neatly, almost politely, on the third-floor landing, with no luggage, no companions, and a look of mild surprise still etched upon his pallid features. Lord Peter Wimsey, who had arrived in the small coastal town of Whitbourne under the pretense of an unremarkable holiday and the very real excuse of procuring a particularly rare edition of Horace for his library, discovered this peculiar situation as he leaned nonchalantly against the polished walnut desk of the Hotel Beau Rivage. The silent bell, never more silent than that morning, marked the absence of human intervention in a matter which, to most eyes, was already hopelessly complicated. "Ah," said Wimsey, fingering the brass hotel key labeled 19. "So our friend has taken the liberty of turning a routine occupancy into a permanent exhibition. Curious, isn't it, that the bell never rang, and yet the body appears exactly where it might have been least expected." His voice, low and slightly amused, carried the exact tone one might employ when discussing a mislaid teacup, rather than a corpse. Inspector Merbles of the local constabulary, a man who approached crime with the solemnity of a tax assessor, frowned from the top of the stair. "Lord Peter, this is hardly the time for quips. The man, well, we have no identification, no papers, and no clue to his habits. He may have been a foreigner or a runaway, perhaps." Wimsey's lips curved in a faint smile. "Runaway, you say? My dear Merbles, the evidence suggests he did not so much run as he was prevented from leaving. Observe the key. It remains in your custody. Observe, too, the absence of a suitcase in the hall. One does not travel lightly in Whitbourne without raising a suspicion or two." The inspector sighed, rubbing a furrowed brow that had never before known amusement. "Are you suggesting murder?" "Merely suggesting," Wimsey replied with a slight bow of the head, "that the extraordinary often masquerades as the mundane until one peeks behind the veneer of civility." He tapped the key lightly against his cheek, as though it were a particularly stubborn puzzle piece. "Now, the first question, always the first question, is why a man should die in a corridor, rather than the privacy of a bedroom. A trivial query, you may think, yet triviality is often where the truth hides." By this point, the hotel staff had gathered. Mrs. Fairchild, the manageress, in her habitual lavender gloves and severe bun, a porter who looked perpetually on the verge of fainting, and a chambermaid who, despite having cleaned the corridors for 15 years, expressed a curious mixture of awe and horror. Wimsey's eyes, sharp as a surgeon's scalpel, measured each one of them in turn. "Let us be precise," he said. "No one saw our gentleman arrive yesterday afternoon. No one observed him leave, no luggage, no letter, nothing but key 19 and a body." He inclined his head toward the silent bell, which seemed to recoil from the idea of intervention. A quiet death, yet one that speaks volumes. The devil, it seems, is in the details, and, alas, so is human nature. Even as he spoke, Wimsey's mind was cataloguing minutiae invisible to all others, the faint scuff marks near the third-floor landing, the slightly askew carpet that hinted at hurried footsteps, the delicate perfume trace clinging to the banister, incongruous with the otherwise masculine odor of the deceased. These were the puzzle pieces others overlooked, and Lord Peter, with his characteristic mixture of irony and insatiable curiosity, had already begun to see the outline of a narrative more intricate than mere misadventure. "I must insist," Mrs. Fairchild whispered, clutching her pearls as though they might ward off the spectre of impropriety, "that the police—" "Indeed," Wimsey interrupted politely, "but allow me first a small indulgence. Observation, my dear Mrs. Fairchild, is the only theatre in which human folly performs without the masks of civility. And sometimes," his eyes flicked toward the third-floor corridor, It is precisely in the corridors that the truth prefers to lounge, waiting for the right audience. The inspector muttered something about paperwork, but Whimsy had already turned, glancing down the hall toward room 19. Somewhere, amid the brass fixtures and wallpapered calm of a respectable hotel, the first threads of a mystery were quietly unraveling, and he intended, as ever, to follow them to their bitter, illuminating end. Whimsy began his inquiries in the unassuming way that so often disarmed those he questioned. With polite attention, an almost imperceptible tilt of the head, and the occasional well-timed observation that seemed tangential but was in fact carefully calibrated. He spoke first with Mrs. Fairchild, who hovered nervously at the edge of the lobby, wringing her lavender-gloved hands as though the mere act might exorcise the spectre of impropriety the dead man had left behind. "Mrs. Fairchild," Whimsy began, his voice smooth yet insistent, "you mentioned that no one saw our guest arrive. Might I inquire as to the precise hour of yesterday's arrivals? And, incidentally, did any other visitors request room 19 in the days prior?" The manageress blushed, fumbling for her notebook. "It was, yesterday afternoon, sir, around 3. But I assure you, Lord Peter, no one requested 19 before. It's a new key, indeed never used, except for housekeeping checks." Whimsy nodded, noting the slight hesitation, the way her eyes lingered too long on the brass key in his hand. "Curious," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "And the bell, silent, you say? One would think a visitor, even discreet, might leave a hint of presence, a note, a luggage tag, a casual greeting." The chambermaid, a small bird-like girl with wide, anxious eyes, chimed in with her own contribution. "I saw him on the 3rd floor," she said, voice quivering, "but only for a moment. He carried nothing but—" "Nothing, really. Just a handkerchief and a very, very clean coat, and he walked as if he knew he had the whole floor to himself." "Indeed," Whimsy replied, tapping his lips lightly with the key. "One does not carry an air of absolute entitlement without reason, or at least practice." His eyes twinkled, but he allowed the unspoken meaning to hang delicately in the air. The porter, a solemn man accustomed to silence, added a detail that seemed trivial, yet caught Whimsy's attention instantly. "I noticed, sir," he said slowly, "that the corridor lights were dimmer than usual on the 3rd floor. I thought it was merely a blown bulb, but, well, it was odd." Whimsy's brows rose. Dim lights, no luggage, a silent bell, and a solitary figure moving with unhurried assurance. All these threads suggested a careful orchestration, a choreography that defied the ordinary. "Do you lock the corridor doors at night?" he asked, a question so simple that it drew a faint look of incredulity from all 3 staff members. "Yes," Mrs. Fairchild said quickly, "but the 3rd floor, well, the door to room 19 was always left slightly ajar for inspections." "And yet," Whimsy observed, "no one heard him enter or depart. Not a whisper, not a creak, not even a faint shuffle along the carpet. Remarkable." He allowed himself a small, ironic smile. "It would appear, my dear friends, that we are dealing with a visitor who does not merely occupy a room, but inhabits an entirely private temporal sphere." The staff exchanged nervous glances, unsure whether to laugh, faint, or take the remark as subtle reproach. Whimsy, noting their discomfort, pressed on. "And the surrounding rooms? Any unusual noises? Guests disturbed or upset?" "No," the chambermaid said, shaking her head. "It was very quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. I thought it odd, but, well, it's a hotel. One expects some silence, yes?" "Quite," Whimsy agreed. "Yet the devil is in the details. Silence is often more revealing than noise, and the absence of disturbance, paradoxically, may be the most telling feature of all." He stepped back slightly, letting his gaze drift over the corridor, noting the faint scuff marks near the landing, the subtle indentation in the carpet where a suitcase might have rested, and the peculiar, lingering trace of a gentleman's cologne, a scent that seemed deliberately restrained, yet oddly familiar. His mind began to assemble the tableau, each observation a delicate tile in a mosaic that refused to be seen clearly by anyone else. "Now," he said, turning to Inspector Merbles, "let us consider the obvious. A man dies in a corridor, without luggage, without papers, and without witnesses. The ordinary inference is either misadventure or malice. But observe the details: the absence of struggle, the precise location of the body, the unbroken silence. Our man, whoever he was, clearly anticipated something or someone." As he spoke, a small, seemingly insignificant motion caught his eye. A shadow flickering behind the half-open door of a nearby room, a figure retreating with deliberate caution. Whimsy's lips curved faintly. It was a minor curiosity, perhaps nothing at all, yet in his experience, nothing is ever merely nothing. The investigation, he realized, had begun not with a loud clamor of accusation, but with the quiet, precise unraveling of domestic life, where every glance, every hesitation, and every careful omission might conceal a motive as potent as any dagger. And so, amid the lavender-scented anxiety of the staff, the dim corridor, and the silent bell of a hotel that had never seen such a mystery, Lord Peter Wimsey set himself to the slow, inexorable work of untangling a puzzle whose solution would demand a scrutiny as exacting as it was patient. By mid-afternoon, the hotel's usual tranquility had become curiously tense, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Wimsey, with the patience of a cat observing a particularly recalcitrant mouse, had begun a careful circuit of the corridors, revisiting every minor observation, every hesitation, and every shadow that the staff might have overlooked. He was joined now by Inspector Merbles, whose solemnity seemed almost to bristle under the strain of watching a man treat a homicide scene as a theater of subtle intellect rather than a site for immediate conclusion. Their attention first fell upon the chambermaid's remark about the corridor lights. Wimsey knelt and examined the fittings with the meticulous precision of a horologist. "You see, Merbles," he murmured, pointing at the faintly tarnished switch plate. "A simple observation. The dimming is not uniform. The bulb nearest the landing has clearly been tampered with. Loosened slightly, not enough to fall, but enough to reduce illumination. Someone desired a shadow, and a shadow only, along the stretch of carpet where our unfortunate friend was discovered." The inspector frowned. "But why? To avoid detection?" "Not quite," said Wimsey, rising and adjusting his jacket. "More likely to encourage a misperception. The dim light suggests an unremarkable hallway, yet in truth every step along it could be precisely tracked. Note the scuff marks, shoes of varying tread, some recent, some older. The perpetrator, or at least a second party, moved here with intent, yet left the illusion of solitude. Clever, if inelegant." The porter, who had lingered close by, suddenly added another seemingly trivial detail. "I noticed the janitor checked the third floor early this morning, sir. He said nothing was amiss, but I thought perhaps he missed something." Wimsey's eyes narrowed. "Indeed, the janitor. Curiously, his rounds intersect with neither our staff nor the guests. We must inquire. What did he see, or, more to the point, what did he fail to see? Omissions often speak more clearly than statements." A knock at the door drew their attention. It was a visitor, one who immediately introduced herself as Mrs. Helena Cresswell, a guest from the adjoining wing who, with carefully measured civility, claimed to have witnessed nothing but ordinary comings and goings. Yet her gloved fingers fiddled nervously with a brooch shaped like a fox's head, and her gaze flitted repeatedly to room 19. "I hardly thought it my business," she said, voice measured but trembling. "But I did notice someone in the corridor yesterday afternoon, though I cannot be sure it was the gentleman of whom you speak. He seemed agitated, yet polite." Wimsey's eyes, sharp as a raven's, followed the twitching of the fox's head. Agitated, yet polite. a contradiction in terms only if one presumes agitation to manifest as rudeness. Yet humans are subtle. The most agitated may mask it beneath civility. "Tell me, madam, did you note the direction in which he moved?" "To the left," she replied, almost too quickly. "Toward the stairwell." Wimsey inclined his head, noting the promptness of the reply. "Interesting," he said, almost to himself. "The stairwell, a common route, yet no one below observed him, no luggage clattered, no greeting sounded. We are beginning to see a choreography that anticipates observation, yet evades it entirely. One wonders at the purpose of such discretion." Mrs. Cresswell hesitated, then added, I thought he carried a small package, sir, or perhaps a book. I am not certain." "A book," Wimsey echoed thoughtfully. "Or perhaps merely the appearance of one. In criminal enterprise, as in theatre, appearances are often the most necessary deception." He glanced at the corridor again, noting the slight unevenness in the carpet and the faint, lingering fragrance of civility overlaid with something more pungent, a hint of cigar smoke, barely perceptible yet distinctly masculine. "Observe, Murbles. A visitor who moves with deliberate care, who employs shadows, scent, and perception to shape the narrative. The question is, to what end?" The inspector rubbed his temple. "You make it sound like a performance, Lord Peter. Do you think this guest had an audience in mind?" "Precisely," Wimsey replied with a faint smile that suggested amusement and impatience simultaneously. "Every crime, like a play, is staged for an audience, sometimes one that never arrives. And in this case, the audience may be ourselves, patiently tracing shadows, watching the scene unfold with apparent innocence while the author of the act has long vanished." At that precise moment, the porter's nervous eyes widened. "There is a gentleman waiting in the lounge," he stammered. "Claims he has urgent business regarding room 19. He would speak only with Lord Peter Wimsey." Wimsey's lips curved ever so slightly. "Then, Murbles, it seems our drama introduces its first actor. Let us see whether he performs with transparency, or if his role is yet another layer of carefully constructed misdirection." And with that, the investigation pivoted once more, the quiet corridors of the Beau Rivage stretching before them like a stage set awaiting the next revelation, every shadow and whisper potentially a clue, every gesture of civility masking motives more dangerous and intricate than anyone might have dared imagine. The gentleman in the lounge proved, at first glance, the embodiment of the obvious suspect. Tall, impeccably dressed, and radiating an air of entitlement, he introduced himself as Mr. Leonard Havisham, a solicitor from London with business interests in Whitbourne and a particular claim on the late guest's affairs, though he volunteered that he barely knew the deceased personally. His eyes, however, flicked constantly toward Wimsey with a subtle wariness, and his hands, gloved in soft brown leather, fidgeted with a silver pocket watch in a way that suggested both habit and concealed anxiety. "I understand you have some questions regarding room 19, Havisham said, his voice smooth yet calculated. "I should imagine that the police have most matters in hand, but I am quite willing to assist in whatever capacity you deem necessary." Wimsey regarded him with faint amusement. "You are very obliging, Mr. Havisham. Yet one must always remember that obligingness may conceal a great many things. Pray, tell me, you knew our guest?" "Merely professionally," Havisham replied promptly. "He was a client of mine in matters of property. Nothing more." "And yet," Wimsey murmured, tapping the key lightly on the table, "you arrived with alacrity to offer your assistance. Curious, is it not, that a man whose relationship with the deceased was so minimal should appear so immediately at a scene that promises notoriety?" The solicitor smiled thinly, yet there was a flicker of irritation, or perhaps unease, in his eyes. "You are implying that I might have motives?" "Not implying, merely observing," said Wimsey, in his archly neutral fashion. "Observation is merely the polite cousin of suspicion, you see. One notes a pattern and wonders, quietly, what might lie behind it. Havisham cleared his throat and leaned back, his posture slightly stiff. "I confess," he said slowly, "that the room in question was of some personal interest. I was expecting papers, some documents, perhaps, that our guest promised to leave with his solicitor. It would not have been unreasonable for me to inquire." "Indeed," said Whimsy, letting the word hang like a thin, ironic thread in the air. "And yet here lies the paradox. You claim to expect documents, and yet the body appears unattended, without papers, and the corridor remains mysteriously silent. It is almost as if fate or design has seen fit to deny us the convenience of clarity." The inspector, growing visibly impatient, muttered something about motives and evidence, but Whimsy raised a delicate hand. "Patience, Murbles. The truth, much like a fine clock, requires careful winding before it strikes." He allowed his gaze to wander again across the lounge, noting the subtle tensions among the hotel staff, the lingering scent of cigar smoke, and the slightly ajar window that let in the faint brine of the sea. Each minor irregularity compounded the narrative: a crooked carpet, a dimmed light, a shadow retreating behind a door, and now a solicitor whose timing was at once convenient and precise. "Tell me," Whimsy continued, directing his attention to Havisham once more, "did anyone else have reason to enter room 19 yesterday? Staff, other guests, perhaps?" The solicitor hesitated, clearly weighing the consequences of speech. "No one, to my knowledge," he replied carefully. "The staff would not have disturbed him without instruction, and there were no other visitors. It was, as far as I understand, a private room." "Yet someone was there," Whimsy said softly, almost to himself as he rose and moved toward the window. "And this someone, whoever it may have been, left no trace that is immediately apparent. No luggage, no call for assistance, no disturbance to alarm even the most attentive guest. Remarkable, isn't it?" Havisham's composure wavered ever so slightly, a crease appearing between his brows as though he were recalculating his story in real time. Whimsy, noting the micro-expression, allowed a faint smile. "Mr. Havisham, you will forgive me if I appear inquisitive. One finds, in such matters, that the smallest hesitation or overshoot of certainty may speak louder than pages of sworn testimony." The room fell into silence, save for the soft tick of the distant clock, a counterpoint to the invisible rhythms of observation and deduction. Whimsy, tapping his fingers lightly against the window-sill, allowed the tension to settle like dust in a sunbeam. Every detail, every minuscule reaction was catalogued in his mind, for in mysteries such as these, the tiniest inconsistency is often the fulcrum upon which the entire solution pivots. And as Mr. Havisham sipped his tea with forced composure, and the inspector scowled at the apparent lack of progress, Lord Peter Whimsy's thoughts had already begun tracing invisible lines between the corridor, the dimmed lights, the faint perfume, and the curious presence of the solicitor. Somewhere within that lattice of observation lay the key to the truth, and as ever, he intended to uncover it, with patience, irony, and the inexorable logic that had long distinguished him from both criminals and policemen alike. Whimsy lingered over tea a little longer than was strictly necessary, not out of thirst, but to observe. Every twitch of a finger, every half-smile, every tilt of the head was catalogued in his mind as if the room itself were a page in a ledger, and he, the meticulous clerk. Mr. Havisham, outwardly composed, was beginning to reveal small fissures in the veneer of calm that only a trained eye could detect. A fleeting glance toward the corridor, a brief hesitation before answering, a slight tightening of the jaw. "Tell me, Mr. Havisham," Whimsy began lightly, tapping his teaspoon against the china, "have you ever noticed how the smallest domestic habits, clock chimes, carpet edges, the alignment of drapes, can so convincingly suggest order, when in fact chaos lies just beneath?" I'm not sure I follow," the solicitor said, frowning slightly. "Indeed, most people do not. Whimsy said, inclining his head. Yet consider this, the third-floor corridor. Dim lights, precisely scuffed carpet, faint fragrance of civility overlaid with, if one were to detect it, the faintest trace of cigar smoke. One could hardly call it evidence, yet it is, for the observant, highly suggestive. Havisham shifted in his chair, unease flickering across his face. I assure you, Lord Peter, I'm here purely to assist in any way that I can. I had no knowledge of any incident prior to your visit. Whimsy smiled, a subtle expression that conveyed both amusement and gentle irony. Of course, one must always give every man the benefit of the doubt. Yet it is remarkable how the benefit is often generously accompanied by a host of tiny, almost imperceptible contradictions. He leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice as if confiding a secret. For instance, you claim to have expected documents yesterday afternoon, and yet our guest has neither delivered them nor left any trace of their existence. You will forgive my insistence, but such incongruities are the sinews of a puzzle. The inspector, seated to one side, muttered something about motives, inheritance, and opportunity, but Whimsy's attention was elsewhere. He was observing the staff again, the chambermaid, the porter, even Mrs. Fairchild, who hovered at the doorway, attempting a discreet watchfulness. Every nervous glance, every shuffle of the feet, suggested the presence of an unseen choreography, a careful management of appearances. Whimsy's thoughts turned to the corridor itself. Dim light, scuffed carpet, the faint perfume, these were not random, nor was the precise location where the body had been found. Someone had planned this scene, and someone had expected it to be interpreted in a particular way. Perhaps the solicitor knew more than he admitted, or perhaps he was merely an unwitting participant in a far subtler design. "Inspector," Whimsy said at last, standing and brushing the crumbs from his cuff, "we must now consider the timeline. Every step, every movement, every minor discrepancy in observation matters. A man who enters a corridor unnoticed, who leaves no luggage, who maintains a facade of solitude. This is no accident. We must retrace his journey, minute by minute." The inspector groaned softly, but Whimsy's eyes gleamed. "We shall begin with the simplest question. Where was everyone at 3 o'clock yesterday afternoon? Staff, guests, and our solicitor." It became immediately apparent that even minor discrepancies in memory and routine were significant. The chambermaid's account placed her at the end of the corridor, yet her testimony about the brief flicker of movement conflicted with the porter's recollection of checking the third floor at almost the same instant. Mrs. Fairchild insisted she had not seen anyone beyond the lobby, while Havisham maintained that he had not left the lounge, though a faint smudge on the corridor carpet suggested otherwise. "Curious," Whimsy murmured, stepping closer to the landing and inspecting the carpet scuffs again. "Not one step, but many. Not one movement, but overlapping movements. It appears our friend was not entirely alone, though no one claims to have witnessed it. This, my dear Inspector, is where observation begins to separate the diligent from the careless. And I suspect, if we follow these minute threads, we shall find more than one actor involved in yesterday's choreography." Havisham's composure began to crack imperceptibly. He cleared his throat, but Whimsy's smile, arch and patient, disarmed the interruption before it fully emerged. "You see, Mr. Havisham," he said, voice low and precise, "it is the minor details that speak with the loudest clarity, and you, like all who enter the stage of a carefully managed scene, will do well to remember that the observant eye perceives everything, even what is intended to remain invisible." The solicitor nodded quickly, and yet there was a tightness in his shoulders, a hesitation in his gaze that suggested he understood the implication all too well. Meanwhile, the staff, each caught in the web of observation, seemed to sense that the investigation had moved beyond questions of simple fact into something far more subtle. A contest of perception, a silent duel of wit and deduction in which even the smallest gestures carried meaning. And so, with every eye in the lounge now slightly more alert, every mind quietly calculating, Lord Peter Wimsey began to trace the faint lattice-work of actions, omissions, and contradictions that would, in time, reveal not only who had moved in the corridor at 3 o'clock, but why and to what end. The pattern was delicate, intricate, and invisible to all but the most patient observer. But for Wimsey, the first threads of clarity were already for mine, subtle and compelling in the quiet, sunlit air of the Beau Rivage. Wimsey moved back along the corridor, his hands clasped behind his back, eyes flicking with the careful attention of a man charting invisible lines. The scuff marks in the carpet, the slightly uneven dimming of the lights, even the faint odor of cigar smoke lingering in the stairwell, all these were, in his mind, coordinates on an invisible map. "Marbles," he said, speaking almost to himself. "Let us begin at 3 o'clock sharp yesterday afternoon. Every detail counts. Who moved, in what direction, and how long the journey took. The devil, as ever, is in the duration as much as the action itself." The inspector frowned, rubbing his forehead. "I'm not sure how we can verify times, Lord Peter. There are no witnesses who can be certain." "Ah, but witness certainty is not the sole measure of chronology," Wimsey said, lifting a finger. "One must consider the predictable habits of human motion, the distances involved, even the time required to manipulate minor objects. Let us see." He bent to examine the stairs, the slight give of the banister, the echo of a footstep that might yet reveal its direction. "Here, for instance," he said, tapping the polished wood. "The descent from the 3rd floor to the lobby takes precisely 31 seconds if one is brisk but unhurried. Any deviation from that timing suggests either hesitation or premeditation." Marbles blinked. 31 seconds? "Exactly 31, more or less," said Wimsey with the faintest trace of amusement. "And yet our body was found on the landing, not fallen accidentally, not in a struggle. Placed, it would appear, with precision. Someone either timed the journey or ensured that the final position was exactly as intended. The question, of course, is why." The chambermaid's voice broke in from the corridor. "Sir, I remembered something. Yesterday I thought I heard a door click, just once, from the wing where room 19 is. I assumed it was a guest returning, but I can't be certain of the time." Wimsey straightened and regarded her with keen interest. "A single click, you say? And a single event is often the key to a puzzle crowded with noise. Do you recall which door?" She shook her head. No, sir, just somewhere along the 3rd floor." "Precisely why timing is so crucial," Wimsey murmured, moving toward the stairwell to demonstrate. "If we imagine our visitor moving from his room, manipulating the light as noted, we may reconstruct his progress, step by step. Every pause, every adjustment in the carpet or the banister tells us something about the intervals and intentions. A seemingly trivial pause may, in fact, indicate an encounter or a miscalculation." He retraced the route along the corridor, stopping at each minor irregularity. The slight shift in the carpet edge, faint handprint on the polished banister, the ghost of a perfume trail that did not belong to the deceased. Each element suggested an intentional sequence, a choreography designed to create a misperception of solitude and spontaneity. "The simplest approach," Wimsey said, "is to catalogue movement as one would record notes in a musical score. Observe the tempo, the pauses, the accents. Here, one footstep lingers longer than the rest. Here, a hand lingers on the banister, either to steady itself or to adjust an object. These are our timestamps, Marbles, more reliable than any testimony, because they were created unconsciously by the agent himself." The inspector sighed, but even he could not suppress a sense of fascination. "So, you think someone orchestrated the whole scene to the second?" "Precisely," said Wimsey, eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the light and shadow along the corridor. "And yet orchestration is one thing, motive another. We now have a man, or perhaps two, whose movements were deliberate and whose intent was concealed. Our task is to understand why the choreography was performed, and, equally, why the audience, the staff, the guests, the police, was meant to witness only fragments of it. He paused at the landing where the body had been found, studying the precise placement of the deceased. Note the angles, the placement relative to the banister and the door. This is not random, Merbles. The body was positioned to be seen, yet only partially. A deliberate tableau, designed to suggest accident or misadventure, yet revealing the sophistication of its author to the trained eye. Timing, position, and subtle evidence of presence are all inextricably linked. Once we establish the intervals, the choreography becomes legible. Whimsy stepped back, the faintest smile playing on his lips. And now we have the outlines of a chronology. All that remains is to confirm each movement, cross-check it against our observations, and see where the story falters. One false step, one discrepancy in the timeline, and the carefully constructed narrative begins to unravel. The inspector glanced nervously at the corridor, then at Havisham, still seated stiffly in the lounge. "You really think we can reconstruct everything so precisely?" Whimsy's gaze returned to the landing, cool and deliberate. "When one attends to detail, Merbles, every movement, every hesitation, every shadow tells a story. And the story of room 19, I assure you, is far more revealing than anyone yet imagines. The first cracks in apparent certainty are already appearing. They merely require patience and the right eye to see them." And with that, Lord Peter Whimsy began the painstaking work of tracing each step, each second, and each subtle anomaly along the corridor. A process that would reveal not only inconsistencies in the red herring's testimony, but also the hidden architecture of the crime itself, laid with invisible precision along the familiar, quiet floors of the Beau Rivage. Whimsy returned to the lounge after his meticulous survey of the corridor, his expression calm, almost indulgent, but his mind working at a pace that left the rest of the room in relative stillness. He seated himself once more, folding his hands in front of him, and allowed the solicitor, the inspector, and the anxious hotel staff to gather their thoughts. In that quiet, measured pause, it became evident that the simplest explanations, the man's arrival, the apparent solitude, the lack of luggage, were inadequate to account for the web of observations he had catalogued. "Now, Mr. Havisham," Whimsy began, his voice light, yet carrying a subtle insistence. "We have noted the peculiarities of yesterday's chronology. I would be grateful for your assistance in clarifying a few matters that seem, on the surface, trivial, but may in truth illuminate the more elusive corners of this puzzle." The solicitor's lips pressed into a thin line, but he inclined his head. "Of course, Lord Peter. I am at your disposal." "Excellent," Whimsy said, leaning back with the air of one about to illustrate a particularly fine point of music theory. "Let us consider the deceased. Room 19. No luggage, no letters, no papers. Yet someone arrived, someone departed, and we have a silent corridor, dim lights, and a minor but telling olfactory trace of a gentleman's cigar. Tell me, Mr. Havisham, did your client have any companions? Friends, colleagues, correspondents?" Havisham hesitated. He was quite solitary. I cannot say that he had any close acquaintances here. Business associates, perhaps, but none who were visiting the hotel at the time. "Solitary, yet not invisible," Whimsy observed. "A man may live alone but leave footprints that intersect with many. And yet, in this instance, the intersections are curiously absent. Tell me, did he maintain a regular correspondence?" "Yes," Havisham admitted. "Letters mostly, and certain documents were expected. Financial papers, deeds, and so forth. He insisted they be secure." "Ah," Whimsy said softly, his mind already connecting lines others had failed to see. "Secure, yes. One must wonder, then, whether security was the concern of the occupant or of someone else entirely." He paused, allowing the words to linger, as though giving the air itself a chance to speak. "Because You see, a person's routine is often its own shield, and yet routines are also the map to which a cunning observer may refer. Our guest, it appears, had a pattern, but one which yesterday was interrupted. The inspector shifted uncomfortably, sensing the invisible complexity weaving itself through the conversation. You mean someone interfered? Interfered, guided, perhaps even manipulated, Whimsy replied, eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The minute details suggest orchestration beyond the ordinary. Our visitor, or perhaps another party, moved with care, accounted for observation, and yet left a story fragment for us to assemble. He rose and began pacing the lounge, noting each person's reaction with the precision of a conductor listening to the first strains of a symphony. And here is the curious part, he continued. While we have focused on the movements, the times, the subtle marks, we have not considered the possibility that the deceased himself led a double life. Every human being has secrets. Some are minor, some monumental. In this case, I suspect the man of room 19 had a past, a concealed identity, or a particular concern he believed would remain hidden. The lack of luggage, the absence of correspondence, even the solitary cigar trace, these are clues to a life lived in partial shadow. Havisham's composure faltered just a fraction. A double life? He echoed. I'm not sure I understand. He was simply my client and... Precisely, said Whimsy, stopping mid-step and allowing the statement to hang. To the casual observer, the man is merely a client, a solitary guest, a brief occupant of a corridor. Yet to the observant, even a corridor tells stories. The precise angle of a hand on a banister, the faintest displacement of a carpet edge, the dimming of lights at the exact location where one might pause or adjust an object. There is, I assure you, more to him than meets the eye. Mrs. Fairchild, hovering at the doorway, suddenly spoke. I remembered something just now, sir. He received a visitor yesterday morning. Someone came, briefly, no luggage, no announcement. I thought it was a mistake, that perhaps the man was a relative, but now I'm not certain. I did not see much, only a shadow in the hallway. Whimsy's gaze sharpened. Precisely. A brief visitor, unnoticed, unremarked. And yet, in combination with the other observations, the timing, the corridor lights, the scuff marks, the cigar scent, it all begins to suggest a deliberate pattern, a choreography of secrecy and exposure. The deceased was not merely solitary. He was cautious, practiced, perhaps hiding more than even he realized could be revealed by the tiniest discrepancies. Inspector Merbles exhaled slowly. So the man had secrets, and someone took advantage of them? Possibly, Whimsy replied, inclining his head. Or perhaps he was ensnared unwittingly by his own habits. Every action, however minor, leaves a mark, and in this case, the marks are legible to those who read them carefully. There is a second identity here, subtle but undeniable, a life of which the hotel staff, the solicitor, and even the police are only beginning to glimpse the outline. A faint tension settled over the room as the implications of Whimsy's observations rippled through the assembled company. Every glance, every hesitation, and every gesture now carried new significance. The narrative of room 19, previously considered simple, had grown complex and layered, with shadows not only of those present, but of lives half hidden, secrets half told, and a pattern waiting to be unraveled. And as Whimsy's eyes swept over the lounge, calculating and patient, it became evident that the investigation had entered a deeper, more intricate phase. The double life of the deceased was no mere conjecture. It was the fulcrum upon which the mystery pivoted, and the next steps of inquiry would have to navigate this hidden terrain with both subtlety and exactitude. Whimsy returned to room 19 with a quiet deliberation that contrasted sharply with the growing restlessness of the inspector and the staff. The door, slightly ajar as if inviting scrutiny, revealed the usual hotel furnishings, a neatly made bed, an unoccupied writing desk, and, most notably, a window that had been left open to the afternoon breeze. He approached it slowly, allowing his gaze to take in the angles, the locks, and the faint impressions along the sill. The air smelled faintly of salt from the sea, mingled with the lingering trace of the deceased's cologne. A combination oddly domestic, yet strangely evocative of a clandestine meeting. "Observe, Myrbles," he said, indicating the window, "how something so trivial as an open pane can alter the narrative entirely. This is no accident. A breeze, yes, but deliberate, to suggest access, to mislead an observer into imagining an entry or escape that may never have occurred." The inspector squinted. "You think the killer left it open to create a false impression?" "Perhaps," Whimsy replied, tapping the wooden sill lightly. "Or perhaps our unfortunate guest did so as part of his own careful pattern, unaware that it might later serve as an unintentional clue. Either way, it is now evidence. One must always attend to such details." He moved to the writing desk, fingering the surface with an almost imperceptible precision. Papers had been removed, leaving only a faint impression of their previous presence. "Note," he said, "how the surface bears evidence of pressure, even if the documents themselves are absent. This is a subtle trace, one which suggests that something, financial papers, perhaps a letter, a small package, was handled, moved, and removed, not haphazardly, but with intent. And this, of course, informs the timing. The window open, the documents handled, the corridor traversed, all in a sequence that must have been rehearsed in the mind of someone clever, careful, and aware of observation." Mrs. Fairchild hovered, nervously clasping her gloves. I thought nothing of the window, sir," she whispered. "It's often left ajar for air." "A seemingly ordinary act," Whimsy said with a faint smile. "Yet in the context of our observations, it becomes a crucial coordinate in our reconstruction. Trivialities often wield more power than the dramatic, and the absence of the papers, equally revealing. Someone desired to obscure the trail, to leave the facade of normalcy intact." He knelt, inspecting the carpet and the slight impressions in the dust near the window. "The carpet shows no footprints leading outside," he observed, "which suggests that the window was not used for ingress or egress. Yet its position and the impressions on the desk indicate that something or someone was deliberately positioned to be perceived. The open window is a signal, a misdirection." Inspector Myrbles exhaled, rubbing his temples. "So, someone staged all this. The window, the desk, the corridor. But to what end?" "To manipulate perception," Whimsy said, rising and straightening his jacket. "We are seeing only the fragments. Our task is to reconstruct the sequence, not merely as it appears, but as it was intended to be interpreted by those who arrived after the fact. Every minor detail, the window, the desk, the scuff marks, fits into a chain of deliberate impressions, and in that chain there lies the identity of the orchestrator." Havisham, seated stiffly in the lounge, seemed to tense at the suggestion. Whimsy's gaze, cool and incisive, flicked toward him. "I dare say the missing papers, the open window, the corridor choreography, all are part of the same pattern, and those who are quick to offer explanations, solicitors, staff, even police, may find themselves misled unless they attend to the subtle cues left behind." Mrs. Fairchild shivered slightly. "It seems so meticulous, sir. Too meticulous for anyone I would expect." "Exactly," Whimsy said, inclining his head. "Meticulousness is often the handmaiden of deception, and in the case of room 19, the deception is layered. Timing, positioning, absence, suggestion. And yet it is precisely the careful observer who notes the seemingly irrelevant, who reconstructs minute by minute, who can disentangle the narrative and reveal the underlying truth." He turned back toward the corridor, surveying the landing once more. The open window is not merely a detail, Merbles. It is a clue to motive and opportunity, to the psychological state of our deceased guest, and, perhaps, to the miscalculations of the individual who sought to manipulate appearances. And when we combine it with the chronology, the scuff marks, and the subtle scent traces, the outline of yesterday's events begins to emerge with an alarming clarity. One that, I suspect, will unsettle those who presume simplicity where none exists. And so, with the faint salt air brushing against the pane and the quiet tension of anticipation thick in the room, Whimsy began the careful work of reintroducing every dismissed observation into the broader narrative. Each detail, once trivial, now resonated with significance, drawing him ever closer to the truth that had been carefully concealed in the quiet, measured spaces of the Beau Rivage. By evening, the Beau Rivage had taken on a quiet theatricality, as if the very walls were aware that a revelation was imminent. Whimsy, pacing slowly in the lounge, allowed the shadows to stretch and settle across the carpet, observing the interplay of light and space with the meticulous attention of a man preparing a stage for a performance. Inspector Merbles, seated with a mixture of impatience and awe, fidgeted with his notes while the hotel staff hovered nervously, sensing that they were now spectators of a drama whose outcome they could scarcely predict. "Observe," Whimsy murmured, gesturing toward the corridor, "how the interplay of light and shadow affects perception. One may stand here and see nothing of import, yet a single step to the left, a shift in angle, and the story is revealed in its subtle distortions." He paused, eyes glinting with that peculiar combination of amusement and intent. And it is precisely these distortions that allow the careful observer to draw conclusions invisible to the untrained eye. He directed the inspector's attention to the landing outside room 19. "Now, Merbles, consider the path of our suspect, or perhaps it is better to say, the choreography of yesterday. The scuff marks, the dimming of lights, the slight impressions on the carpet, they are notes, each one deliberate. Our task is to play them back in sequence, to reconstruct the music of action that occurred without witnesses." He moved to the window, gesturing at the faint trace of the deceased's cologne mingling with the salty air. "And here," he said, "is the final instrument in our orchestra. The open window suggests entry or exit. The absent documents, handled but not retained, suggest purpose. And yet, the footprints, absent. One might imagine a ghost were it not that we know better." Mrs. Fairchild shivered slightly. "It feels almost supernatural, sir," she whispered. "Supernatural, perhaps in effect, but not in cause," Whimsy said, allowing the corners of his mouth a faint smile. "The human mind is clever, my dear lady, and the clever human leaves a signature in every misdirection, every subtle manipulation. Our task is merely to read it and to allow the author of yesterday's events to reveal himself, willingly or not." He turned back to Havisham, who had been sitting stiffly, attempting to maintain composure. "Mr. Havisham, I believe it is time we test the reactions of those who orchestrated the scene or who believe themselves unseen observers. Some minor reenactments, careful placement, slight adjustments in light. These are sufficient to provoke recognition in the guilty party. The innocent remain unaffected, while the culprit cannot resist subtle, involuntary reactions." The solicitor's face tightened imperceptibly. The inspector, sensing an impending moment of revelation, leaned forward. Whimsy's eyes, dark and analytical, swept over the assembled company like a conductor scanning his orchestra, waiting for the first discordant note that would betray the player. "Let us begin," Whimsy said softly, "with a simple reconstruction. Merbles, adjust the corridor lighting as we observed yesterday. Dimmed here, full illumination there. Now, we will place a chair and a small table along the corridor, as they were in room 19, and position ourselves as the observers would have been. Nothing dramatic, merely the setting." The corridor responded as if by design, the shadows falling exactly where they should, the faint reflections of light off polished surfaces creating the intended illusion. Whimsy allowed himself a faintly ironic smile. Now, let us wait. One observes most clearly when the world believes observation is complete. Moments passed. Havisham, initially rigid, began to shift slightly in his chair, eyes darting toward the recreated tableau. His fingers fidgeted, brushing at the watch chain in a habitual gesture, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Whimsy's gaze lingered on these small tells, cataloguing them with the precision of an archivist. "Ah," Whimsy said in a tone of faint amusement, "and there it is." A subtle tightening of the lips, a fleeting glance at the corridor, a micro-adjustment of posture. The guilty reveal themselves not in words, but in the body's insistence on betraying a secret it cannot suppress. Inspector Murbles whispered, almost incredulously, "So he's reacting without knowing it?" "Exactly," Whimsy replied, his voice low, precise. The scene speaks to him. He believes himself unseen, untouchable. Yet even the most careful orchestration cannot erase instinct. The choreography yesterday, Mr. Havisham, was precise. But every act leaves a ripple, and I've simply arranged the water to reveal the stone beneath. The solicitor's hand trembled ever so slightly as he reached for his tea. Whimsy's eyes, coldly keen, followed the gesture. "You see, Murbles, we have arrived at the threshold of revelation. Every minor detail, the window, the desk, the scuffs, the scents, the dimmed lights, now converges to produce recognition, and recognition, once achieved, cannot be unlearned." Havisham's composure cracked just a fraction more, and Whimsy's smile deepened subtly, almost imperceptibly. "Soon," he said softly, "we shall discover not merely who moved in the corridor, but why, and in doing so, expose the delicate web of intention and misdirection that yesterday obscured the truth from all but the most observant eye." And in the hushed anticipation of the beau rivage, the stage was set. Every shadow, every minor object, every carefully reconstructed moment awaited the inevitable confession, the unwitting gesture, and the inexorable disclosure of the hidden narrative behind room 19. Whimsy rose from his chair, the faintest glimmer of triumph in his eyes, and began pacing slowly toward the corridor. Each movement was deliberate, measured as if marking time before a precise performance. Inspector Murbles and the hotel staff watched with a mixture of apprehension and curiosity, while Havisham sat rigidly, hands clasped, the tension in his posture now impossible to conceal. "Mr. Havisham," Whimsy said softly, yet with the weight of inevitability, "we have considered the movements, the timing, the subtle manipulations of light and object, the absence and presence of evidence. We have reconstructed the choreography, noting each pause, each impression, each scent that lingered as testimony to human intent. And we have noted your reactions, which, like the minor scuffs on the corridor carpet, speak volumes." The solicitor's hand trembled as he reached to adjust his jacket. Whimsy's gaze followed every micro-expression with cold precision. "One cannot orchestrate a deception with absolute perfection," he continued. "The most careful actor leaves signs, whether through hesitation, involuntary movement, or the faintest tell in posture or gaze. Yesterday, room 19 became a stage, and you, sir, were both audience and actor." Havisham's lips pressed into a thin line, a small flicker of unease passing over his eyes. I do not understand." "Ah, but you do," Whimsy interrupted gently. "You understand that the documents expected were handled, removed, and that the corridor was traversed with exact timing to avoid witnesses. You understand that the open window, though seemingly trivial, was part of a carefully designed illusion to suggest a narrative of entry or escape. And you understand, above all, that the choreography we have reconstructed exposes more than the casual observer could imagine." The solicitor's composure faltered further, and he swallowed hard, betraying a sudden, almost imperceptible tightening in his throat. Whimsy continued, stepping closer, his voice now quieter, precise, almost conspiratorial. You believed the body would be found in a manner that suggested accident, misadventure, perhaps even oversight. Yet the scuff marks, the impressions on the carpet, the faint aroma of cigar smoke, all these betray the care with which you staged the scene. You timed the movements, accounted for observation, and yet could not control every variable. Even the staff, who were meant to remain oblivious, provided subtle cues through recollection and habit. And these cues, like tiny beacons, guided us inexorably toward the truth. Havisham's hand shook now, the pale color of his face betraying the pressure that had been mounting throughout the evening. I never intended to commit harm, Whimsy said softly, finishing the sentence. No, your aim was control, concealment, the management of perception. But even the most meticulous planning cannot erase human error, nor the instinctive response of a man confronted with his own orchestration. You see, Mr. Havisham, the corpse in Room 19, the missing papers, the subtle adjustments of light and shadow were all part of your careful design. And yet, the smallest gestures, those micro-movements, those hesitations, have betrayed you. The solicitor's eyes darted toward the corridor, toward the window, toward the meticulously reconstructed tableau, and he gave a sudden, almost imperceptible shudder. I thought it would be enough. But it was not, Whimsy said, inclining his head, faintly ironic, yet patient. For in crime, as in music, perfection is never accidental. Every movement leaves a trace. Every hesitation, every adjustment is a note in a melody that cannot be silenced. And when the observant listen, the melody becomes unmistakable. You have played your part with skill, but the symphony reveals the hand of its composer. Havisham sank into his chair, pale and defeated, his rigid posture collapsing under the weight of exposure. The inspector moved forward cautiously, ready to take the solicitor into custody, while Whimsy observed with detached satisfaction. The intricate lattice of timing, misdirection, and psychological nuance had been unraveled, every shadow accounted for, every subtle mark decoded. Whimsy allowed himself a faint smile as he surveyed the room, the staff, the inspector, and the subdued figure of Havisham. There, he said softly, we have the truth laid bare, not by brute force, not by supposition, but by the relentless application of observation, timing, and a patient reading of human behavior. And it is often in the quiet, in the small, seemingly irrelevant details, that justice finds its path. The hotel settled into a subdued silence, the faint scent of sea and cigar lingering in the corridor, a testament to the events of the day and the delicate, inexorable logic that had brought them to light. Room 19, once a stage for deception, now lay stripped of pretense, every element accounted for, every human reaction interpreted. And Lord Peter Whimsy, arch, precise, and quietly triumphant, allowed himself the satisfaction of a case concluded, not with spectacle, but with the inescapable clarity of reason. By the following morning, the Beau Rivage had returned to its superficial calm, yet beneath the polite hum of breakfast service there lingered a residue of unease. Staff moved with slightly measured steps, glancing occasionally at one another, while Inspector Merbles quietly reviewed his notes with a newfound respect for the subtleties of observation. Lord Peter Whimsy, seated with his customary poise, sipped his coffee, eyes half closed as if in mild amusement at the residual tension his deductions had left in the air. "You see, Merbles," Whimsy said, breaking the morning quiet, "the beauty of such cases is not merely in the solution, but in the revelation of human nature. Mr. Havisham's intentions, while flawed, were guided by a peculiar elegance, a meticulous orchestration that betrayed both caution and overconfidence, and the truth, as always, resides in the interplay of minor details, overlooked habits, and instinctive reactions. The inspector nodded, though he still seemed slightly overwhelmed by the layers of subtlety he had witnessed. "I must admit, Lord Peter, I have never approached a case in such a theatrical manner. And yet everything you said last night, the corridor, the window, the desk, fits perfectly. It's remarkable how the smallest things can reveal so much." Whimsy allowed a faint smile to curl his lips. Remarkable indeed, and often underappreciated. Human behavior is far more candid than we credit it for. Every gesture, every hesitation, every adjustment is a syllable in the story we all unwittingly compose. And it is our task, when duty calls, to read it accurately. He rose, adjusting his gloves, and cast a glance around the lounge where the staff lingered, careful to appear unobtrusive. "As for the hotel, I imagine that order will now be restored. Room 19 will be cleaned, the papers accounted for, and life will continue with the quiet efficiency of well-practiced habit. Yet the subtle echoes of yesterday remain, like faint footprints in sand soon to be washed away by the tide." Mrs. Fairchild approached timidly, holding a small tray. "Lord Peter, thank you. I did not understand at first, but now I see how all the little things mattered." "Indeed, my dear lady," Whimsy said with gentle warmth, inclining his head. "And it is often the quiet diligence of observers, such as yourself, that allows truth to emerge. Do not underestimate the significance of noticing what appears trivial. It is precisely what carries weight in matters of subtle deception." Havisham, now pale but composed in a subdued way, was led away by the inspector. His parting glance toward Whimsy was a mixture of reluctant acknowledgement and quiet resentment, the acknowledgement being that his carefully arranged illusion had been wholly dismantled by intellect and observation alone. Whimsy lingered a moment at the window, watching the pale sunlight play across the sea. He inhaled, allowing the briny air to mingle with the faint memory of yesterday's cigar, corridor scuffs, and displaced documents. Even in a crime concluded, there is a certain satisfaction in the precise alignment of logic and human psychology, and he savored it with that quiet, almost aristocratic contentment peculiar to him. Finally, turning to the inspector, he offered a faintly arch smile. "Merbles, do remember this. The solution to such mysteries is rarely in brute force, nor in dramatic confrontation. It is in the patient, observant reading of the mundane, the alignment of a curtain, the faint impression of a letter, the way a man hesitates before he speaks. Observe carefully, and you shall find the world speaks plainly if one only has ears to hear." With that, he gathered his hat and gloves and, with the air of a man who had both solved a puzzle and enjoyed the theatre of its revelation, he departed from the Beau Rivage. The hotel staff watched him leave, still bewildered but quietly impressed, and Inspector Merbles, notebook in hand, allowed himself a deep exhalation of admiration. Lord Peter Whimsy's departure left behind the calm of order restored, the subtle satisfaction of justice rendered without spectacle, and the lingering knowledge that even in the quietest corridors the truth waits patiently to be discovered by the observant, the patient, and the quietly brilliant.